And so that's good. And for a change, you're actually going to be the one being interviewed, which has got to be different for you.
Yeah, very frightening.
Well, I got you once already for my film, but I figured I'm really excited with this new platform, this radio thing on the internet and the web TV thing, because the information I've been gathering for my film, as you know, is life saving, life altering. Teach people how to cure themselves of cancer holistically, and then also to wake them up to the fact that you're not allowed to do that for your children. They're forced chemo, radiation, and surgery, as you know, because that's what I was interviewing you on my film about earlier. So it's good that I'm able to get this information out quicker now with this new platform, and then the movie will sum it all up too when that's all said and done. So how's things going with you? What's new since I interviewed you at the Long Beach Health Festival, right?
Well, I mean, life rocks and rolls. I tell you what, broadcasting 6 days a week, it's hard to keep from getting dizzy once in a while. But what's clear is that the feds and the medical monopoly doesn't know even what cancer is. There was a story I think we just covered on today's broadcast about the redefinition of cancer. They acknowledge that, well, maybe they were all wrong about these cancers and maybe they're not as deadly. And another story about living next to or near these fossil fuel burning plants, whether it be oil or coal, and the benzene released, and there's a link to cancer clusters there. I mean, these are things that patently obvious, what I would call your moment of duh, regularly on the Robert Scott Bell Show. And yet we're seeing more and more of this kind of news coming out, vindicating all that we have said in the natural realm as a homeopath, as a natural healer, and all the medical doctors who have been persecuted and prosecuted simply for acknowledging that cancer is not a deficiency of chemotherapy, radiation, or even surgery. So it's just strengthening what we've been doing for many years. And I'd have to say the consciousness is shifting. It shifts slowly. They fight it as long as they can until they have to admit it. And then they'll say, well, it was self-evident all along. We knew it. What were you doing all those years? Well, they were drinking some pharmaceutical Kool-Aid.
Right. Yeah. Well, for some of those people out there that may not know, I mean, you're like the guy over at naturalnews.com, Mike Adams, the Health Rangers Network, and how did you get into being the health guy? I mean, what was it that brought you to doing what you do today on the radio?
Well, I was a boxer, and I threatened. No, I'm just kidding. I've done this for so many years. I started in broadcast media in 1999 and got nationally syndicated in 2002. So I've been in the broadcast media for a long time. And Mike Adams, I admired him for many years with what he had started with Natural News, and would have him on as a guest every once in a while. And his presence on the internet kept growing, and he was a fan of the show as well as a fan of his. And we struck up a friendship just over the years and mutual respect. And we talked about wanting to get this message out more frequently than just once a week. Yet not many in the broadcast, what we call the traditional, even mainstream talk radio, if you can call it that, had a place to accept or understand the message that I was delivering. Once a week they could tolerate, but 5 or 6, no. So Mike and I talked about it. Is there a way we could make this through the spoken medium of radio available more frequently, and discussed the launching of Natural News Radio. And we did that about 2.5 years ago on the Natural News platform, which has grown to be the #1 as far as largest alternative health media type site on the planet. And it's been growing strong ever since. And I'll just tell you and your audience now, we've been hinting at it for a while, but we're working behind the scenes to bring the Robert Scott Bell Show out 5 additional days of the week, co-branding with Natural News and a syndicator to radio, and that may be happening within the next 2 weeks. So we're very much on the verge of an exciting leap out even bigger. And of course, the reach is global already through Natural News, but also domestic U.S. syndicated radio is going to be accessing this information soon as well.
Yeah, wow. So you helped build that with Mike. You've been along the whole time.
Yeah, well, we were the launch program for it, and then a number of good programs have been added along the way, and trying to round out some messages and voices that wouldn't normally get heard in traditional media. So it's been a great endeavor, and it's still growing. But at the same time, the media is shifting to recognize, just look what's happened with Alex Jones and his success within the traditional broadcast syndication barter type media, and it's quite astonishing. So it tells you that it is possible to bring a message like this out. It is accepted now, and there is an economic support mechanism to make it work, because let's face it, if they could make money off of it, they would find a way to get it on there. And that's always been the issue. The economics have been too easy from big pharma and other aspects of global corporations with no allegiance to any nation or state. And that's what drives pretty much the messaging in the mainstream media. The advertising there is all about drugs and occasionally cars, but mostly drugs.
Yeah, it's amazing that Alex Jones is busting out the way that he is. And Mike is coming out too, yourself, myself, Ty Bollinger, everybody that's in the health world. You can't really not get involved, which some people may call conspiracy theories, but after a while you kind of got to call certain things facts. And you kind of wonder, why would, in the alternative health world, why people say it to me all the time, like, don't bring up 911 because it takes away from what you're talking about. And I'm like, but I found out about 911 because I was researching Rockefeller owning the pharmaceutical companies in the early 1900s, which he, bought out the medical schools, and next thing you know, that's what they teach. So, I mean, you can't have one without the other. Have you found that? Sometimes people say, why don't you guys just stick to the health instead of the political stuff?
Well, that's been, from the very beginning, I could never stick to just the health issues, because my journey, Ian, and from talking to me before, has been one of a discovery through the motivation to be well. Because I wasn't well to begin with the first 24 years of my life. I suffered with chronic diseases, vaccine damage, antibiotic damage, and food that was not adequate, not organic. And my discovery, or let's say my prayers for health, led me to discover some of the things you've just mentioned here about the history, not only of America, but planet-wide, about the collusion and cover-up of natural ways to heal, and of course nutritional aspects of that, meaning that most of the diseases that we call infectious disease are actually the result of poor nutrition or toxicological exposures. So it really is a paradigm, distinct paradigm shift from the way we all grew up in the West, thinking that the germs were bad and that it was just a random act of bad luck if you happen to get ill or if you happen to get cancer, which is not something you catch as a communicable disease, but they've been working hard, for instance, with the issue of HPV, claiming that sexually transmitted virus, as it's claimed, will cause cervical cancer later in life. I've disputed that from the beginning as well. But again, we're dealing with a fundamental paradigm distinction. And that's difficult because a lot of times you're speaking apples and oranges to folks out there. And they really have no bridge in. So my talent, if there is one, is an ability to make that bridge possible from the medical side of things, understanding or their misunderstandings, bringing it into a holistic framework, and interacting with that community, at least those that were open-minded. If they weren't, I didn't have a lot of time for them because they pretty much own the rest of the airwaves. So we had to work very hard to balance out any little bit we could from what they were delivering.
Okay. Yeah, the key is how do we get sick? And you've got something there about the germ theory and the law of terrain. Do you want to speak a bit about this?
Yeah, well, if you remember growing up, if those of your audience are Westerners, even Western Europe, although more so in North America, we've been really razzle-dazzled by what's known as the germ theory. Origin points point to Louis Pasteur, who was a contemporary of Antoine Béchamp. Pasteur had the favor of the emperor. It's all who you know. That's throughout history. That's been true. And because of that, what he stole from Béchamp and others, he basically claimed that it was basically the germ that was the cause of disease. They would find some kind of micro something, some kind of life form that they had never seen before, would create disease by its very presence. So the, let's say, boiling down of the germ theory states that it is the mere presence of or contact with a pathogen that will result in disease. So if I were to sneeze on somebody or in an audience and sneeze on the audience and the virus would fly about the room, everybody would contract it and everybody would get sick. That's obviously seemingly an overly simplistic way to understand it, but that's basically it. Whereas Antoine Béchamp, Claude Bernard, and others recognized the real way disease was created was not because you were exposed necessarily to a germ, but that you had upset the terrain or milieu or environment from within. And that corruption gave rise to new life forms. So if you change the terrain, you change what grows there. So it wasn't so much what you caught, it's what you created via what? Nutritional deficiency or toxicological proficiency. Just talk to an organic farmer about his soil or her soil. Ask them about healthy soil versus soil that is unhealthy, that is polluted and toxic, and ask them what grows there. They will say visually it's a distinct and marked difference. You can look into a lake that is pristine and healthy and clean, and you can test the water and see what is there, and you can test a polluted lake, and you'll find that pathogenic life forms, bacteria, fungal species, viral species, will be prevalent in the polluted lake, much less so or almost none there in regards to disease-causing, as they call it, organisms in that clean lake. Again, the law of the terrain is something that we have not been taught in the West, and they still really don't teach it within allopathic Western medical schools, which are all designed, as you know, to look at all life as having a drug deficiency of some kind.
You're a homeopath yourself, right?
Yes, don't be frightened.
Oh, so was that how you got started in this? Were you doing that before radio?
Yeah, in fact, I was learning about homeopathy, back in the early 90s. And partway through my training, it appeared on a radio station in Atlanta, WSB 750 AM, that's a 50,000 watt station, with my mentor at the time. We appeared on for an hour. We were scheduled to be interviewed about alternative medicine and homeopathy. And 4 hours later, the host said he'd never, except one other show, I think he had the switchboard lit up for 4 straight hours. We talked about a lot of very controversial things, including cancer, the fact that it was not, the result of necessarily genetic issues primarily, and the fact that it could be cured. We also talked about AIDS and the fact that it wasn't caused by HIV. You want to talk about outrage on the airwaves. Oh, my gosh. But at that moment, for me, in 1994, I realized that I had a knack or ability to communicate these principles that were seemingly lost to America or the West in a way that could be understood, even if it was outrageous to those who had heard it within the medical profession in particular. And I kind of planted that seed in my head, I guess, that one day maybe I could do this. But it wasn't until 5 years later that we actually launched a show in Atlanta and then eventually went into national syndication. So there were a lot of pathways along the way and then a parallel track into media. But that media track spoke to me very, very intensely because I felt like my culture, if you will, my country, America, had lost it, completely lost it in terms of its understanding of health and healing. And in fact, learning about homeopathy, I'd never heard the word until I was 24 years of age. I didn't realize that the university I went to, Emory University in Atlanta, taught homeopathy in its medical school up until about 1949, one of the last areas to do so. So if I went back, in fact, to my memory growing up in the South, even though I was a New Yorker by birth, I went back into the Civil War museums after learning of homeopathy and recognized that the Civil War troops, in fact, had first aid field kits, medical kits, and they all contained homeopathic medicines. So I realized then that we had been completely lied to. Somebody had erased history from our eyes so that indeed we could be controlled and manipulated to believe that modern medicine had been around forever, even though we knew it hadn't. But anything that preceded it or had a parallel existence was wiped from memory very efficiently and effectively. And you mentioned Rockefeller, Carnegie, the Flexner Report of 1910, which set the stage 100 years later for Obamacare. But even prior to that, the medical monopoly was on, so it wasn't good under Republican administrations either. This is a nonpartisan or transpartisan destruction of health and healing in America, which still seemingly they can't get their head out of the pharmaceutical pill bottle with the advent of Obamacare, or the Republicans' attempt to repeal it. They would just go back to the pre-existing medical monopoly, which wasn't a lot better.
Now, do you think there's any hope for us in our medical system as far as ever coming around? I mean, it's down to the bottom lines of it's the elite that run the world. We understand the 1%, the Illuminati, whatever you want to call them, Bilderberg. I mean, the rich are running the show. We can't get good medical care in our own country. They're dumping chemtrails on us. There's GMOs on our food. I mean, it's pretty obvious that they actually just are trying to reduce the population. Is there anything that we can do anymore, do you think?
Well, if there is hope, it's hope for bankruptcy, funny enough. I mean, the inability to pay for it is something that will eventually cause it to collapse, and that's frightening for most, but for me, I really see that's where the revival or renaissance happens in healing. Because at this point, from the standpoint of a blast into the mainstream, it's not going to happen. There's too much of a police state in force right now, whether it be FDA or even state boards of medicine, and the whole concept of licensure is pretty much guaranteed the limitation on or the elimination of anybody that would try to pop their head up and say, hi, I'm a doctor or a non-doctor, and I can help you overcome cancer without chemotherapy, radiation, or surgery. So the medical monopoly has to collapse in order for this to rebuild. And again, this is a very scary thing. Many of my friends who happen to be considered progressives or liberals who still believe in this federal intervention into healthcare is the only hope that we have, don't acknowledge, or if they do, they kind of turn a blind eye to the recognition that nothing in that progressive so-called healthcare Obamacare system actually has anything to do with healing. It has everything to do with managing diseases and profiting from them, and of course bankrupting the average person along the way. And this is something that the pharmaceutical industry had to have in Obamacare, because too many people were starting to leave the medical monopoly. And in order to strengthen their ability to have a future, they needed a way to mandate participation, which is what Obamacare is. There is no homeopathy in Obamacare. There are no herbs. There are no supplements. There is no detoxification. There is only vaccinations and mammograms, for instance, and drugs, of course, plenty of drugs. So the idea that this is a healthcare system that we have is a false premise at its very beginning. But we don't get there because the scattershot arguments from Republicans and Democrats is arguing about privatization of a system that is not private, that is not involved in any shape or form liberty or freedom or health freedom. And so we're in a mess, and that's why I say the collapse has to occur in order for the revitalization to happen, when people realize that healing was nothing what the government had invested in or mandated or enforced via licensure. So it's sort of a long answer to your question, but yes, there is hope, but inevitably it has to come crashing down for the rebuild to occur, and then we'll have a healing revival in this country.
Yeah, once people see what you and I have seen, that it'll be over tomorrow. That's what I always laugh about. It is only 1% of them. All we got to do is what Iceland did. Get rid of the politicians and the bankers and bail out the people, not the bankers. Do you think this is going to happen though? I mean, really, because you and I know what has to happen, but do you think it's going to happen?
Well, there's no way that it won't happen. It's an impossibility. I mean, as sure as gravity exists ultimately. But again, our power, I should say this for the first time tonight, our power of belief is so very powerful that it seems to be overcoming the force of gravity, in that we have such an incredible debt-based system. It's not just the monetary system that is phony, but the medical system in large parts are phony as well. Now, I don't discount the fact that you can put Humpty Dumpty together again in an allopathic emergency trauma center. That's brilliant, and that will never go away, the need for that. But the idea that they could be utilizing their techniques of poisoning the body in other areas for revitalizing or bringing health back into the body is absurd, again, on its face. So that part of the allopathic system will have to crumble, and then the freedom of all the healers that genuinely know how to heal, whether they be a doctor or not, whether they be licensed or not. In fact, I foresee the end of licensure as well, because once people realize that licensure was never about protecting the public and only about protecting the economic self-interest of a particular industry, you'll recognize that what you're looking for are people that are qualified to heal, not based on the fact that they have a license by some state, private, semi-private government organization, but by their capacity to have people that have come through their system and they're alive and well, and they can speak, and they can say, yes, this is what I did, this is what I had, this is where I am today. And in this way, you as a human being can actually make an informed decision about the method or the direction you want to go. As much as I'd like to say, let's ban vaccines, and I wouldn't argue that that might not be a healthy thing to do, I'm so much a proponent for freedom that as long as there was a free market, and not a pseudo-free market, but I mean where the ideas could flow, where you could speak freely about natural medicine, cures for disease. And I don't mean you can go out and hang your shingle and lie overtly. But if you say, I believe that the dirt in my backyard can cure cancer, and as long as you say, listen, I have no studies to show it's true, it's just a belief I have. If someone were to say, well, that's good enough for me, that's how much I believe in freedom. Freedom to screw up is inherently something given to us by our Creator. That is free will. And the government tends to want to, as they claim, protect us from ourselves, but in reality what they're doing is protecting the economic self-interest of those who profit off of disease. So the idea is truthful and not misleading and not lying about what you do. If you are a medical doctor, say so. If you got a graduate degree, say so. If you don't, then say that. Let people know your true background. And if you are engaged in fraud and deceit, there are laws that predate any medical laws or licensure laws that could be utilized in a minimal governmental situation that could protect the public or would allow you to be made whole again, barring that you're not killed. But the large numbers of people that are killed are not being killed by homeopathy or herbs or Reiki masters or acupuncturists or chiropractors. Chiropractors are licensed. They're being killed by the licensed modern medical doctors, even some of the DOs who have adopted this drug everything that moves methodology.
Right. Let's, because we kind of skirted over it a little pretty quickly, was the HIV things. There's a lot of people out there that don't know this. I didn't know it until recently. And I learned it from you and Liam Sheff about HIV. The HIV test, folks, apparently turns out to be bogus. It not only doesn't accurately tell you you're going to get AIDS, it doesn't really do anything. So they give you the AIDS medicine, and then the AIDS medicine kills you. And so they say you die of AIDS. This is true, right, Robert?
Well, it's pretty simple when you look at it. Step back and look at it. Now, you have to understand that I grew up at a time as a Generation Xer that this AIDS thing came on the scene, and we were all told that now sex would kill you. It wasn't that you could get a sexually transmitted disease like gonorrhea or chlamydia or syphilis, and then you take an antibiotic or a round or whatever, and then you'd be cured. The theory was anyway. But this one was going to kill you. They didn't know why. It'll happen in 6 months. It'll happen in a year. Then they said 2 years and 5 years and 10 years and 25. I mean, it kept changing over time. So initially I had the reasonable belief that, yeah, there was this new plague that was killing everybody, primarily gay people. But they extended it to hemophiliacs, and then they said Africans. So just so you know, my background was such that as I was raised pharmaceutically and medically, I had no reason to dispute it, no knowledge of this initially. But as I was trained in homeopathic medicine, talked about the difference in the distinction between the germ theory and the law of the terrain, my mentor in homeopathic medicine, when he saw this, he said, this doesn't make sense. What they're saying is not accurate. This is not the way disease happens. This is not the way microbes work. And then discovered the works and writings of Professor Peter Duesberg, who was considered a heretic, even though he was the golden boy. I think he was the youngest member ever elected to the National Academy of Sciences. And he could do no wrong. There was no grant that he was ever turned down for. And in fact, he wrote at a certain point in this new so-called gay disease or plague that these people were killing themselves with a lifestyle, a drug-based lifestyle, that these drugs that they were on, the amyl nitrate poppers, which were immunosuppressant, the vast, extraordinary use of antibiotics like no time in history, because they really did have a lot of sexually transmitted diseases because of the things they were acquiring. And it was literally destroying them from the inside out. And in fact, that population, they had predicted that there would be something devastating that would happen to it. Now, I'm not saying from a, what we call it, a religious dogma or condemnation. That's not where I'm speaking from. I'm just speaking purely from biology, physiology, immunology perspective. You cannot destroy your gut with antibiotics for years and years on end and expect to have a healthy, long life. And so this was pretty much what Duesberg had said. Now, he disputed then the cause of being HIV, that Robert Gallo and Luc Montagnier, Gallo stole supposedly some debris or material from Montagnier and then claimed he had discovered it. That was a whole ruckus behind the scenes there that came out. But bottom line, they had said that it was a retrovirus that they never even isolated. And then Gallo, of course, had patented a test that he said would detect it, yet every test, if you read behind the scenes or into the inserts or even the FDA's own acknowledgement that these tests, as you said, the HIV test, could not be utilized to definitively diagnose AIDS, much less acknowledge or corroborate or definitively say that someone actually had or did not have this so-called HIV. Then we step back more, and I encourage people to read Liam Sheff's book, Official Stories. The whole chapter on it is astonishing. See the documentary film House of Numbers as well, that there is no test. It's not a test for HIV. It's nonspecific. It's cross-reactive. It'll test positive for 120 different things, including pregnancy. And in fact, if they don't dilute the blood extraordinarily, it will test. You'll get a positive test in 100% of the people. And of course, the test being determined to be positive, or maybe it's positive, maybe it's not, depends also on what country you're in. Also depends on the color of your skin in some cases. If you're an upper middle class white housewife that's married and you test positive, they'll say it's a false positive. If you're from the inner city and you're a black woman and you could be married, doesn't matter, they'll say, well, no, that positive is a real positive and you have it. And they'll put you on drugs, of course, in the early years, early 90s, particularly when they put people on AZT, which was a failed and very dangerous chemotherapy drug that was banned because it was too toxic for cancer patients. It ended up killing thousands of people, and they claimed that was AIDS, and then they repackaged it in lower doses and said, aha, now it works, and now, look, the AIDS patients are living longer because of our drugs. This has all been a scam and a ruse, and it was a pharmaceutical windmill tilt that was very profitable for the survival of the Centers for Disease Creation and Promotion, otherwise known as the CDC. So there's a lot of scams in the cancer industry, but the cancer industry was waning and they needed a new cancer. And the so-called HIV/AIDS scenario was that boondoggle that would be profitable for many decades to come. And we're still reeling from that. And the community that still believes in HIV or HIV testing is basically setting themselves up for slaughter over time, and we've seen far too much of that. I'd like to see an end to that as well, but end the HIV test and you end pretty much what AIDS is, which is immune deficiency, which is real, but for any number of causes that pre-existed and had more to do with lifestyle, behavior, and drug toxicology.
Yeah, well, look at the Baby Rico story. I mean, classic example, right? You know which one I'm talking about?
Oh, yeah. Cheryl and Steve Nagel and Lindsay Nagel covered their story many years ago on the air and been following that. It just breaks my heart every time I think about it. But this goes back to some other discussions we had for your film that you're working on still about jurisdictional issues. And how is it possible that you can make a decision as an adult to not take chemotherapy? I just get emotional when I think about the Baby Rico story, because this baby, born healthy, they gave an HIV test to because they knew the mother, Lindsay Nagel, had tested positive in her childhood years, being adopted from Romania, coming over. But her parents, Steve and Cheryl, had recognized and found from Professor Duisberg that the HIV test was not necessarily a test for HIV. And they were the only one of many children in Minnesota at the time, so-called diagnosed, that pulled their child, Lindsay, off of all of the drugs. And she was the only one of those children, 10, 15, 20 or so, to have survived. She's a healthy young lady and had a baby. And that baby they took and told her that they would have to force feed this medication or they would steal this baby from her. And so this is a big disaster, that there is no freedom for your children. If you're a parent, mom and a dad, and you have a different perspective on medicine, your child could be claimed by the state and will be claimed by the state, particularly when it comes to cancer or this issue of AIDS. And that means that the First Amendment is no longer in effect. What is the First Amendment to the Constitution of the United States? That was the Bill of Rights. First Amendment being the freedom of speech, freedom of religion. Congress shall make no law respecting the establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. And that is the violation there with the state-sanctioned religion. Don't kid yourself. America has a state-sanctioned religion, and it's not Christianity. It's not Judaism, and it's not Islam. It is modern medicine. And if you don't believe me, you explain to me how they can take children based on the parents' belief that modern medicine is not appropriate for their child. Now, I'm not telling you that it's appropriate to withhold medical, let's say, interventions in life-threatening situations like accidents and trauma. But in terms of these chronic diseases, because they hold the monopoly and the state sanctions that religion of the medical monopoly, you do have, I mean, you try and define it some other way. It's a state religion.
That's very true. That whole Baby Rico thing just slayed me. I mean, they said to the child services, look, we've been through this before. I was a child that was told was HIV. They gave me the drugs. It almost killed me. I got off the drugs. I was fine. So the same thing is going to happen with my kids. So we don't need the drugs. Thank you very much. And they said, oh, yeah, too bad, because this is 20 years later or whatever. And now they have laws. Child Protective Services can come in and just take your child. And that's basically what happened to them. And they're doing it to people with cancer as well. There's a couple families I've been following. You know the one, Jay Matthews situation, right? You remember that one?
Yeah, I interviewed Jay, and we saw him at the Health Freedom Expo as well. My heart goes out to him. And it's a difficult situation because he's very much involved in the system as a licensed pharmacist and had an awakening, but didn't realize the evil that he was up against in the pharmaceutical and medical establishment in taking children. I mean, it's like a ritual slaughter in the worst of the death cults, demonic death cults out there when it comes to children with cancer or these chronic diseases that are life-threatening. And that is why we spent such time, your interview of me at the Health Freedom Expo out in Long Beach last year. Was it last year, I think, already? Or earlier this year. The fact of the matter is, the jurisdictional issue is one that has to be explored very intensely, because the question is, how is it possible that the state can take ownership of a child in such a situation? And I just don't hear that discussed often enough, and that's why we talked about it. And again, I don't know. I sometimes mention it on the air. It's almost too much for people to fathom. Certain basic things that they assume are normal and natural and right to do in America are the very things that put their children at risk when they have children in that marriage. And, I don't mean to oversimplify it, but it does come down to that aspect, because in law, everything is about jurisdiction. If jurisdiction can't be established, there's no way in. But if it is established, then you have no way out, just about. So it's devastating, absolutely devastating. And as I said, I don't know if others have covered it with you, Ian, but I think it's so very important to bring out.
Yeah, I've talked a bit about it with Joni Cox, and I hopefully we'll be talking to the parental rights.org soon to find out what they're doing. And I had a good interview with Dr. Leonard Colwell recently on this show, and he's kind of getting on the up and up with all the contract law and the constitutional law, and it appears, and that's what you and I were talking about a bit too, that we may be going that way, because once, people don't know this, but as soon as you get a birth certificate for your child, that child is now owned by U.S. Inc., not you. And same when you get married and you get a marriage certificate, same thing, now you're owned by U.S. Inc. Am I correct in that?
Yeah, it's licensure is something that I discuss often, and I'm vehemently opposed to it. Why? Because it is a process of subjugating yourself. It's a process of asking for permission where none is required, and you do that as an adult. You become a child. You become basically someone that is not able to stand on their own. And that's the concept of medical licensure, the doctors of chiropractic that went down that road because they fought for what they called credibility. I don't want that kind of credibility. In fact, even if they offered licenses to homeopaths, I would refuse them and reject them outright, because I don't ask permission where none is required. Healing is a birthright. It is a primary fundamental human right. The ability to heal yourself or heal others based on the freedom to associate in this way. And yet the very concept of asking for permission puts you under, subjugates you, puts you under the jurisdiction of that which would control and own you, or the fruits of your marriage, for instance, in the context of a marriage license. Why should you ask permission of government to enter into a holy union or matrimony between yourself and your loved one? That used to be the purview, if you will, of the church, if you will. You would go and your preacher, whoever, would bless it. You would how would you do it? You'd in your family Bible, these rites of passage, you just list it there. It's as simple as that. You didn't ask permission of the state. Now, this is an interesting history lesson because after the so-called Civil War, the War of Northern Aggression, the war between the states, however you want to qualify it or call it, the 14th Amendment, the citizenship change that occurred, that you were no longer sovereign, but now you had become subject to the jurisdiction of the District of Columbia, 10 miles square. And at that point, it changed the nature of the American, the human American who was sovereign, not because of any governmental decree or sanctioning, but because by your very birth you were acknowledged to be so, as opposed to in England, the crown was the sovereign, the king or the queen, and everyone else was its subject. That was the antithesis of what what the design for government was in America. Now, the idea of asking permission to marry is rooted in a slave-type mentality, particularly a form of evil racism, because after that war, the people wanted rights, but they really weren't granted rights. They were granted privileges by government. And at that point, this idea of marriage license came into being, particularly and only when a white person, a Caucasian person, wanted to marry a black person. You had to ask permission before that was granted by the state. And somehow that has transpired over the ensuing decades to century, plus that everybody had to ask permission of government to get married. And it's a false assumption. It's incorrect, and nobody should ask permission of government. And this is what is also astonishing to me for those who want to have gay marriage. I could care less whether you have that. It doesn't impact my marriage. But why would you want the government to sanction your relationship? Unless you were interested in receiving a benefit from government. And if that's the case, when you accept the benefit, you're going to have to accept the strings that are attached. And those strings are pretty damned ugly when it comes to having children. Because those strings, as you said, attach to those children, the fruits of the labor, the fruits of your marriage become property or wards of the state at their pleasure, at their whim. And their whim right now primarily is when you reject the religion of modern medicine. That's their litmus primarily. People say it's all about, well, if you abuse your children. Well, yeah, sometimes there are cases where you can point to Child Protective Services doing a good service and pulling a child out of a very dangerous situation. But that's more rare than reality. Reality is they're pulling children out of families who refuse to inject toxic poisons that would kill them in the treatment of cancers that were brought on by things sanctioned by the state, including vaccinations, including drugs, including processed foods and additives and preservatives and colorings and flavorings and pesticides and herbicides and fungicides and GMOs, genetically modified organisms. All of these sanctioned by the state. When you reject that, they give you a label, according to the Psychiatric Bible, of orthorexia and oppositional defiance disorder. I'm telling you, the only people that are going to survive this are orthorexic and are ODD. And if you're not ODD, you better become ODD, or else you're going to go down with that medical ship. Not making any sense here, Ian.
Yeah, oh, absolutely. Absolutely. It's just insane what's going on. But one thing I always wondered about, okay, let's just say, because I'm even though I'm 44, I still haven't had children, and I'd love to. If I could find the right woman, I would love to have a family. And if I do, I could be in trouble because I think that I'm allowed, even God says in the Bible, right? You can defend yourself, you can defend your loved ones, you can kill if you have to in self-defense. So if somebody was to try and tell me that my kid was going to get the chemo, radiation, surgery, they're trying to kill my kid, and I think I'm allowed to use whatever it takes to make sure that my kid doesn't get hurt, which is probably why I don't have one yet.
Well, yes, if you're willing to defend your children, as any parent could and would normally. Once you perceive the threat that modern medicine is in these cases, you have the ultimate right to use deadly force in defense of your child. Now, am I authorizing and advocating? I mean, this is not what I'm saying. I'm just saying, you have to be in that situation. You have to be right with yourself and your Creator to recognize that, and your birthright to defend your children. I've often referred back to my good friend Michael Badnarik, who ran for the presidency from the Libertarian Party in 2004. He was their candidate, and shortly after he got the nomination for the Libertarian Party, I was one of the first, if not the first interview, right outside the hall there. And I interviewed him about a number of topics, and he jokes he was like a deer in the headlights because he didn't expect to win the nomination. But one of the topics at that time in 2004 was, post 9/11, a lot of trial balloons about mandating vaccines, bioterror scares. And I asked Michael, I said, the government is talking about mandating vaccines for smallpox and different bioterror issue things. What's your perspective? And he, being the true libertarian, one who loves liberty, says, well, here's my perspective. Doc, you bring the needle, I'll bring my 45, and we'll see who makes a bigger hole. He just was dead serious, because he recognized the assault with a potentially deadly weapon that a vaccine is. And until the American people recognize this, they will shirk or shriek in fear. They'll be in terror of the authorities and the authoritarians and not stand up. When you do stand up, it's like the bully you finally punch on the nose. You find out that they're actually cowardly. Now, that's not to say that I would also not recognize that there is risk in standing up to a bully. But at some point, we simply must, because to not do it is more dangerous than the threat of doing it, standing up to the bully. And then when one does it, that's a living example for another and another and another, and then the cascade arrives, and then potentially a peaceful, nonviolent revolution occurs where people recognize that the sanctity of their home and their family is something that cannot be tread upon by any governmental authority when there is no evidence of harm or intent to do harm, particularly by the parents who are simply defending their children against the assault of a dangerous religion, again, being the church of biological mysticism. John Rappaport coined the phrase, that is modern medicine.
Right. Now, for contract loss, or for when, let's just say I have a kid and I don't want them to be in the system, so I don't get a birth certificate. Well, then what happens down the line when they got to go to school and they got to get a passport because their little league hockey team is going to Europe, or like what happens?
Well, my kids don't have birth certificates. We don't have a marriage license, and they have passports.
How do you do that with? And do you not get a Social Security as well, or?
They don't have that either.
How do you get documentation then without having all that?
Well, you have birth affidavits, you have witnesses, you have Bible records, whatever you need to do. You provide it to them, and if you've read the application for passports, there are means by which you can do that. I'm not saying it's easy, but we actually used our congressman at the time to help push that through, because we were basically abiding by the laws as they were written in regards to that. So all of those things that you mentioned are not required in order to attain a passport. But I'm not saying it's easy, but I am saying that it is possible because I know firsthand.
Okay. Yeah, I always wondered about that and how you get a... so do you pay taxes?
All taxes that I lawfully owe.
Okay. So that means no. All right, interesting. Let's see, what else did I want to cover?
Probably covered some of this with Dr. C, didn't you?
Yeah, he was starting to talk about this because I'm still
topic.
Yeah, I mean, I'm amazed. My one guy, Eric, his child, the child services had sided with him. Because the percentage of success rate for her was not good, and he said, basically, you're telling me she's going to get hit with, I don't know, 70 out of the 100 bullets instead of whatever. And they're like, yeah. And he goes, well, that's not good enough. And they agreed with them. They actually agree with them. They're letting him do holistic. They're trying the cannabis hemp oil, which I don't know what you're hearing on your end, but that cannabis hemp oil is curing cancer. It's curing everything.
That more on the show. I've done some interviews about it. But I would rather not have to ask for permission. Follow me here? I'm glad, believe me, I'm glad that she sided with them. But the point is, why ask for permission where none is required? Now, that is perhaps the most revolutionary thought, but that was the dawning of the American Revolution. Why should we ask permission of the Crown of England to do that which was our birthright? That was the basis for the Declaration of Independence, written under what we know of as the Law of Nations. And so there's a lot more depth and detail to this than just jumping off a cliff and saying, well, I'm going to live differently. Yeah, I mean, that's a starting point, but do your homework. I don't encourage people to do it blindly, but recognize that there is an existence that is yours. You have been given life by that which has created you, and that even goes beyond your mother and father. And these are the spiritual issues that I encourage you to look into, because ultimately, it's not a governmental legal issue. It's a spiritual issue. It's your recognition of where you are in creation, and how you exist and how you wish to move about the creation cabin, so to speak. So these are very big issues. These are very deep issues, and there'll always be people in government that are willing to take away your freedom because you don't feel you can handle it. And I feel like most Americans don't feel like they can handle it. That's why they have the government that they deserve. The question is, are you mandated to participate in it? And if so, then you are a slave. And if not, then you have some capability or capacity of regaining freedom that you didn't even know you lost.
Now, doing what you've done, are your children safe? If I'm sure I don't know their ages, but I'm assuming if they were under 18 and got cancer, would they be safe if you set it up so they would be taken away from you?
Well, they're not in any system in that regard. And again, you have to look into issues when you talk about law. Jurisdiction is everything. Is there a contract of adhesion that binds them to the government, that government claims ownership over them? There is no marriage license. There is no birth certificate. There is no number. It would be very difficult for them to claim ownership of this. Now, this is an area somewhat of speculation, because you can do everything right and somebody targets you and does what they want to do anyway because they have the guns. But the reality is there are more of us than there are of them. And the question is, do they want to take something like that on? Because that could be the spark that ends them. And so they're not stupid on that level. They make decisions about where they go and who they take on based on the ease of access, based on your posture, based on the fear that you may have, based on your knowledge. All of these things are taken into consideration and account. But we have a whole history that is lost, like I mentioned, about the erasing of medical history in America. And because of that, we have a very shaky foundation for liberty. I can talk about it. People might have a superficial understanding of what I'm saying, but it's very foreign to most Americans, this concept. Very frightening, in fact, and I recognize that. But ultimately, the government will not be able to sustain its position of domination simply because it cannot be sustained via the economic system that is beyond bankrupt. And when everybody is going hungry, there won't be enough FEMA camps to put those people in, because the very people that are trying to put you in it are also going to be hungry. So there's a different kind of apocalyptic future, one that actually is positive, but it may be pretty ugly along the way. I recognize that. And I urge people to look into growing food right now, not waiting for the difficulty in getting it or accessing it or acquiring it based on economic and even energy collapse. We've been discussing a lot on the show recently with Liam Sheff about the issue of peak oil and what that leads to. What does that look like? So there are a lot of factors here. I'm not painting a utopian future, but I'm also recognizing this is life, and life will go on, barring another nuclear catastrophe on the order of Fukushima. It may go on for a lot less of us. So there are real issues that are very dangerous and scary. But while we're here, we plan to do the best we can do, and I plan to provide the healing that is necessary for those who are willing to listen, because it is the God's honest truth, and I say it every hour of my show that the power to heal is yours, and I don't change that because it's an immutable and unchangeable fact of life itself.
Yeah, exactly. And this is a good way to wrap up the last 10, 15 minutes. Come back to the cancer thing. You've been in this business for a long time. Do you have any particular personal stories you would like to share of people that have gotten cancer and were able to beat it?
Really too many, because partly for what I've done myself with helping folks, but a lot because I've been in broadcast media for so many years, interviewing hundreds and hundreds of doctors and non-doctors alike that have worked with it, and laypersons as well. So I'm an accumulator of information, much like you are in what you're doing in media and in film and documentation. But particularly the reality of seeing folks that have had cancer that have either gone through traditional allopathic oncology or not, but either way come out there alive and then have moved more toward or totally toward holistic therapies. It is clear to me that the only way to overcome cancer is to detoxify the body as a primary starting point, but it's not the only point. Beyond that is to replenish the nutrients that have been diminished over time or that are no longer in the food that people are consuming. And in this way, we are talking about a multifaceted approach, but focal pointing many different ways to do the same thing. That is, clean the body of the toxic poisons and metabolic wastes that have accumulated and replenish the body, renourish the body with the minerals, all of the essential elements for the body to function properly. Now, that is the physiology, but we also have to acknowledge the emotional, mental, economic, and even spiritual components of all disease, including cancer. There are a lot of emotional and even spiritual aspects to it. To look at things like Bruce Lipton, the biology of belief, very powerful way to also set you on a course of healing, even if you're in the most dire of circumstances that seem to be untenable. And indeed, you can overcome them. Again, not because you get lucky, but partly you have to believe that you can. And then with that belief in place, things will start to become revealed to you, should you be open to them. If you ask with a sincere and open heart, they will be given unto you. Now, you can talk in terms of religious text or just spirituality, but I've seen that to be also the God's honest truth. I had to be open. My prayers were answered not by a lightning bolt that healed me from 24 years of chronic disease, but by someone being sent to me who could teach me how to heal. And then I could in turn teach others to do the same or even better. And that's what we're here to do, and that's what I do on the Robert Scott Bell Show 6 days a week.
Yeah, right. Wow. Now, you never had to fight cancer yourself, right? It was pretty much everything but when you were younger?
I had many family members die of cancer, aunts and uncles and grandparents. It was very common in my family to look at my elders and see them diminish over time with cancer, scary C word. And they all had gone through traditional allopathic oncology because we were a medical pharmaceutical family. And I knew of their childhood just from talking to them because I respected my elders. I was fascinated by their childhood. I would meet with them and ask them questions about it, what it was like when they were young. And all of them were healthy, every one of them. None of them had allergies like I had. None of them had musculoskeletal inflammatory disorders like I had. None of them had chronic digestive disorders like I had. None of them had chronic recurrent infections of the ears, the sinuses, the stomach, intestines. None of them had the things I had. And yet they died of cancer, mostly in their 60s and 70s, I think one in their 50s. Now, I could put the math together. It looked to me very bleak and dire in my circumstance because the first 24 years of my life I had been ill with something, chronically ill. And so I could see if they were dying in their 50s, 60s, and 70s, I don't know if I would make it to my 40s, but I was sure that if I did, that I would also have cancer based on not having a healthy childhood like they had. And so that drove me as well to recognize that this just wasn't about the suffering I had temporarily as a young person, but that I would not grow old. And so I really was motivated. And because of that, the undoing of all the things that I mentioned and more, here I am in my later 40s. And I've undone those diseases, and I find myself healthier than any time in my life previous and getting stronger. So this is quite an extraordinary transformation. And I joke to people sometimes in my lecture how I got all of my old age diseases out of the way first. Now I'm going in reverse. I'm so cocky as to believe that as I grow older, there won't be other issues that I'll have to deal with. But I recognize it's not necessarily because I'm growing older. It's because I'm not keeping up with the toxic accumulation, and I'm not replenishing that which I've lost, via nutrients bringing into my body. But there we see people that are very old and in very good shape that have incredible livers, strong livers, and they sustain a lot of assault over time, and then they die of not a disease, but they're simply old and they're done. They've lived a long life and they're ready to move on, and they live and move on in a very peaceful way. We rarely see that. We rarely ever hear about that. But that is a natural way of moving on after you've lived your mission in this lifetime.
Right. Have you ever heard this, talking about homeopathy, have you ever heard of this stuff? It's a buffer, pH buffer. It's
Yeah, there are pH buffer homeopathic remedies that will work with pH issues. There are also cell salts that work with a lot of the minerals on a homeopathic level that revitalize, replenish some basic life forces we talk about. When I work with homeopathy, I work on the basis of drainage, which is the French word for drainage or detoxification. And I do that in conjunction with, of course, other mechanisms like increasing selenium levels from food-grown sources or food-grown supplementation, utilizing other foods that can enhance glutathione production. The One World Whey is a wonderful non-denatured whey protein that can assist in that. So there are a lot of mechanisms with which we can cleanse the body, and there are a lot of mechanisms with which we can replenish the body. It's not mysterious. It is accessible to most everybody, and there are more aggressive and sometimes very expensive means by which to do this with, for instance, intravenous chelation therapies or other things, but it's not to say that's the only way. If you can't afford that you can't succeed as well. There are other ways to go, and that's why I can't be a show just about homeopathy. It would be too narrow, and I don't narrowcast, I broadcast, and that's why I cover all of these aspects of healing, including sometimes the allopathic things. If there are necessary interventions, I'll acknowledge that as well.
Right. Okay, I was just curious because I'm personally trying to get my saliva pH has been 5.5 for the last 6 months, which is bad, as you know. But the urine is like off the top. It was good before I started taking this. Now it's like way above 7 or 8. So I didn't know if the homeopathy medicine could actually help. Is it just masking it and making it look better, or is it really boosting my pH?
Well, it's altering what you call cellular or metabolic metabolism, if you will, cellular metabolism. And that there is a function of stasis in the body that tries to find that balance. I will say that, if you take a pH remedy for homeopathic medicine and you consume, a high acid type diet, animal proteins to excess of your needs, you're still not going to overcome that with homeopathy. It's not a powerful sledgehammer in that way. It's not a drug in the same sense of an allopathic drug that can kill you or stop something or force something to start. But in conjunction with other dietary shifts, cleaning up what goes into your body and altering the foods that impact pH in certain directions, it can accelerate a healing and accelerate a normalization in those areas that you're looking to do.
Okay, that's good to know. Yeah, and anybody out there, you should always be checking your pH level, folks, to make sure you're not acidic. And I guess that's about it for our hour today, Robert. I really appreciate you being on. I've looked up to you for a long time now, and you've got a lot of wisdom there, and appreciate you sharing it with everybody out there, man. Do you have anything you want to talk about before we go?
Well, Ian, just gratitude for you and all the work you're doing, and ask you to come on my show tomorrow and
okay.
some of these things, and I can turn the tables on you for a bit.
Yeah, all right, let's do it, man. Well, right on. So anybody watching, if you want to go to iCureCancer.com, we still are taking donations to help finish this film. And if you need any help from anybody, just let me know, people. Appreciate you tuning in. Robert Scott Bell from naturalnews.com and the Robert Scott Bell Show. Appreciate you being here with me today, sir. And I'll talk to you soon.
All right, thanks, Ian.
Bye, everybody. Peace.